sort of these alternative energy advocates, these wind and solar champions had said it's going to cost $61 billion. And I actually think that's a lowball number. Do you think if they would have said that we would be in the position where we are right now in Colorado?
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of PowerGab, your go-to show for all things energy and environmental policy in Colorado. I'm host Jake Fogleman, joined by my co-host Amy Cooke. And today we want to touch on a topic we briefly discussed before, but it merits talking about further, and I'm sure it will come up in future episodes as well, because it really is a big deal what this is. And that is the report that the Colorado Energy Office did very recently. I think they call it the Pathways to Deep Decarbonization in Colorado by 2040. You know, I'll put that in layman's terms. Essentially, it's the first time that the state and the Polis administration in particular have put out any kind of modeling or report to try to put a cost on the state's climate policies. It's something that, Amy, I'll let you kick it off on sort of the backstory on this, but it's certainly something we've been calling for a very long time, and we finally have a product, and it's a little interesting what they put out. And I'll let you give the backstory first before we dive into some of the details.
Yeah, one of the things we challenged this narrative that renewables, that actually I'm going to call them, I like the term alt energy because they really are alternative energy. We've been challenging the narrative that wind and solar are cheap because they're free, and therefore your electricity costs, your utility costs are going to go down. We have been challenging that. The first time I saw us write about it, actually, I'll take credit, I'm the one who wrote it, was in 2010 when there was the first fuel switching, where we said that as we mandated fuel switching away from coal to natural gas and wind and solar, everybody kept saying, oh, it's going to be cheaper, and it's not. It's just not. And we have been proven right on that year over year from 2010. Here we are now in 2014. And Jake, I'm just going to throw this out there, and you'll explain what this number means when we get to the different scenarios on the energy offices on that report. But do you think if sort of these alternative energy advocates, these wind and solar champions had said it's going to cost $61 billion, and I actually think that's a lowball number. Do you think if they would have said that we would be in the position where we are right now in Colorado? I can't imagine Coloradans being on board with $61 billion by the governor's energy office, by the Colorado Energy Office, own very conservative and likely unrealistic estimates. It's going to be much, much higher than that. Remember, these are the same people who have said it's going to be cheaper, it's going to be cleaner, it's going to create jobs. And all of that we can throw the BS flag on, not just because theoretically we think it's true. We now know it's true.
Right.
We have seen, we've experienced, we've lived it. So I say that, but we've been challenging this narrative since 2010. And so every time when they voted, when the legislature said, yeah, let's increase the renewable mandate, there's 10% in the Constitution, let's increase it to 20%, let's increase it to 30%. Well, then it was, what we just do 100%? Like, let's throw a parade and do 100%. Every time they did that, we challenged them. Has anybody said how much this would cost? Oh, it's going to save ratepayers money. Well, we said what we said in 2010. 2017, we did a paper that showed it's going to cost you money, a lot of money. We did it again in 2019. We did it 2017. I've got the paper. We did it in 2019. And then we did it again in 2023. And this is what we said. This three-part study, this is when we did our three-part study. does what no one else has been willing to attempt this thus far, and that is actually put a cost on the on this forced march to wind and solar plus batteries, and then also look at the reliability. So why are we doing this? Well, because Governor Jared Polis, candidate Polis, and candidate Mike Johnson at the time ran on 100% wind, solar, and batteries. That is what they ran on. They didn't run on decarbonization. They ran on 100% wind and solar. And so I pulled up Governor Polis's. This is his own the first roadmap that they put out. Governor Polis ran on a bold platform of achieving 100% renewable energy by 2040. Then they say the goal is motivated by the imperative to fight climate change and curb pollution of our air and water. Then it goes on to say it's going to protect the public health of our communities, create good paying jobs, strengthen our economy, and keep rates low for customers. So he ran on this platform of 100% wind and solar. And we've challenged that narrative repeatedly. We've done what no one else would do, which was actually hire people, commission studies to model costs and reliability. And we've shown you can't do it. You cannot get there without literally sending the state over a cliff. And that's why when they released the decarbonization plan, like, wait a second, you didn't run on decarbonization. Governor Polis ran on 100% wind and solar and is driving the state in that direction. Now, we kept challenging, and eventually, Jake, as you're about to tell, they finally answered us. They would put out these roadmaps. There wouldn't be costs in there. There wouldn't be anything about reliability. But they finally decided they would answer the cost and the reliability question.
Yep, that's right. It really is funny because for the longest time it was just like, just tell us a cost. You know, you can put out these platforms, these plans, that's fine, but tell us what this is going to cost. And come to find out, they put out their own report where, I'm sure we'll get into it later in the episode, why these costs I think are very, very conservative. But nevertheless, even with the costs that they did include, they verbatim admitted that the wind, solar, and battery scenario by 2040 is, quote unquote, the most expensive scenario. It is the most expensive pathway to reaching, as you said, decarbonization now. First, it was just a bold plan to get to 100% renewables. The end goal itself was doing wind, solar, and batteries. Now it's how do we decarbonize, which, you know, is probably a better goal than just picking a preferred resource plan. And nevertheless, they still admit, once again, it's the most expensive pathway to get there. And I want to pull this quote from the Colorado Energy Office, did a slideshow presenting these findings to the Public Utilities Commission. And there's a great line again with, not only is it the most expensive, but wind, solar, and batteries exhibit significant reliability concerns, leaning heavily on import capacity, even with significant in-state resources. So not only is it the most expensive, but it's the one that they have the most reliability concerns, which is exactly what our report found, as you pointed out. The three-part series we did, we said, you know, if you're going to do 100% wind, solar, and batteries, if the weather looks like it's looked in the past in Colorado, particularly during the winter, you're going to have blackouts. And now, from the horse's mouth, the Polis administration admits you will have significant reliability concerns with the wind, solar, and battery scenario, which is just, I mean, it's amazing that that's coming from his administration.
Right. And so we went from 100% wind, solar, and batteries to decarbonization. And I said, does anybody know how much carbon is actually in the atmosphere? It's 0.04%. 0.04%. So, and humans are like 3 to 4%, are responsible for 3 to 4% of that total carbon in the atmosphere, CO2 in the atmosphere. So that makes it even more minuscule. Now, Colorado's responsibility for carbon in the atmosphere is even less. I heard a great analogy. I read a great analogy, and this is I'm saying this for a reason, and I'll get to it. But this point is, if you took a 10-gallon bucket, you can put 1,000 golf balls in it. All of the 999.9% of those golf balls, so 999.9 of those golf balls would be all the other gases in the atmosphere. And actually, the CO2 would represent like a paint chip on the that last 1/10 of the last golf ball. That's how much carbon is actually in the atmosphere, and humans contribute 3 to 4%. And this is, I'll drop the source in there, but in the show notes. But 3 to 4% is human caused. So the state is going over a cliff for that. They are driving our power sector over a cliff for that amount of CO2. And they usually do, they talk about tons in the atmosphere, and it sounds like a really big number, but sometimes percentages actually matter.
Yeah.
And in this case, it does. So we are now decarbonizing as opposed to actually going wind, solar, and batteries.
Yeah, and I think we actually calculated in that report series what total net zero in Colorado by 2050 would mean for the IPCC's climate temperature projections.
That's right.
And I think it was something like 0.02% if Colorado completely followed every goal of the Polis administration. It would shave off about 0.02% of warming by the 2100. So just to put some more numbers on that scale. But to your point, as the Polis administration's rhetoric seems to be shifting away from 100% renewables to just a more generic decarbonization. Outside of that most expensive wind, solar, and battery scenario, they seem to really be kind of tipping their hat at two preferred scenarios instead. One they call the economic deployment scenario, which I would quarrel a little bit with the fact that it is the economic deployment scenario because of some of the things they didn't model. But what this essentially is they say we assume current policies and a current policy projection and current costs. We just assume that the state will continue to build wind and solar till about 70%, and then some batteries and a bunch of natural gas to fill in the gaps. And they say that's the cheapest way that we can get close to decarbonization by 2040. And then they have one other one, which they call the optimized 100 scenario, which seems to be, if we're going to do 100% carbon free by 2040, that seems to be what they're saying is the best way to go. And you'll note that it is no longer just wind, solar, and batteries only. They throw in a ton of hydrogen, a ton of green hydrogen, which is still in its nascent stage and really a boondoggle in the making, which we'll do some more work on that in the future. And I'm sure we'll have our entire episodes about green hydrogen because it is kind of a mess, as well as a little bit of geothermal. And they say at a minimum, that's going to be 20% more expensive. So the preferred cheapest way to get to 100% clean, not even 100% renewable, is at a minimum 20% more expensive, not even including all the costs that they excluded, like transmission, distribution, et cetera. So that seems to be where they're going. It's an admittance that 100% wind, solar, and batteries is not going to be feasible. But it also shows that even if they do a more nuanced approach, it's going to be significantly more expensive for Coloradans.
Yeah, so this transition is really a forced march because I don't think Coloradans have been given the full facts of what all it entails. So this study that they put out and they had Ascend, like analytics or whoever, local. I think they're out of Boulder. Is that where they? Anyway, paid them $200,000 to do this study, and they didn't include transmission lines, which, of course, we talked about that, last week, where we talked about, or the week before, we talked about the new FERC order, which is going to be tied up in litigation. If it goes through, it's good for Colorado because it'll socialize the cost. It's still going to be very expensive.
Yep.
It's going to be very expensive for everybody, but Coloradans at least will get the benefit of folks from Utah and Wyoming paying their transmission bill.
Yep.
But they did. how do you not include transmission costs when we know that that's one of the biggest drivers of utility rates in the country?
Yep. And same with the distribution grid. Listeners may recall the Fenberg-Ryder episode because
That's
they clearly know it's going to be expensive, and so they're trying to make it an automatic fee on your bill so that hopefully you won't notice and you just pay it and keep quiet. And going back to this Colorado Energy Office presentation, another great line, it says, costs for upgrading the distribution system could potentially be a significant additional cost to those modeled in the study. So even, once again, they're admitting we didn't model those costs, and if you included them, it'd probably be a heck of a lot more than what we said this is going to cost. So that's why I take issue with economic deployment and some of these other, the claims they make about these scenarios where, it's still going to be relatively affordable as long as we just ignore all the big cost drivers.
well, the other thing is too, yeah, so long as we ignore all the things that are actually going to make it expensive, just don't talk about the stuff that's going to make it expensive. Forget those. But the other thing is, Jake, when we read this too, if they are also really worried about the reliability of wind, solar, and batteries because, and I am too, after reading the number, I think they way underestimated the amount of wind, solar, and batteries that they would need. It's probably by about 40%. I think in our study, we were looking at if you want to do wind, solar, and batteries, and you want to be honest about it, you're going to need, what was it, about 170,000 megawatts? I think that's what it was. It's somewhere in that.
It's in the hundred thousands. I don't have the numbers right in front of me.
170, 180, something like, anyway. And it may be a little lower than that, but they estimated something like 70,000.
Yep.
So even if you were to, meet in the middle, I think they way undershot what they would need.
Yeah.
That makes, the wind, solar, and batteries is going to be far more expensive than the $61 billion price tag that was put on that, especially like I said, when you had transmission lines and everything and distribution. And then I go back to the question that I initially posed. If you would have told Coloradans, oh, I don't know, back in, back when Polis was running for office the first time, if maybe a journalist, if anybody had been even remotely curious besides those of us that were at the Independence Institute at the time, and willing to ask that question. I was even trying to feed it to reporters at the time, but willing to ask that question. Do you think Coloradans would have agreed to spend the lowball figure of $61 billion to get their power from wind, solar, and batteries? I just think that's a tough sell.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think it speaks to why they hid the ball for so long on costs, despite us, shouting from the peanut gallery, like, hey, isn't anyone curious? You're asking for this society-wide shift in something as critical as energy production. Doesn't anyone want to know what this is going to cost? And I think, to your point, because Coloradans probably would have balked at even $60 billion, like you said, on the low end, I think that explains why. And just going to your point about the capacity, I just want to make a quick note, because they definitely did, I think, lowball the capacity needs for wind, solar, and batteries. And the way they did that was by assuming a massive amount of imports. And the problem with that is, to quote our friend Isaac Orr, the energy bad boy that's been on here before, he paraphrases Margaret Thatcher, and it's a great line, is the problem with that kind of energy policy is eventually you run out of other people's electricity. So it assumes in a vacuum that other states aren't also increasing the fragility of their grid by doing wind and solar, and that, they'll always have excess power to send to us. Utah and Wyoming might, as we said in the previous episode, but other states that are following a similar playbook, that power is not going to be there. So.
And all you have to do is ask Duke Energy what happened Christmas 2022 when a series of issues, a confluence of, I would say, problems. They underestimated demand based on meteorological reports. So they underestimated demand. They had some malfunctions in equipment, which happens. You can account for all of those things, but then purchased power didn't show up. So extra power that they had purchased didn't materialize. So when you have that, you've underestimated demand. Your demand has spiked. You have some equipment that's offline, and then the power you have purchased doesn't show. Guess what happens? You have rolling blackouts on Christmas Eve when it's very, very cold during a cold spell. And that's what happens. So to assume that they're going to get 20% of their power out of state. And also, why would Colorado do that? Why would Colorado lawmakers say, hey, we're going to rely on Utah and Wyoming? What's funny about that, Utah and Wyoming are like, we're not relying on anybody. We're taking care of our own folks. We're going to take care of us. And then if there's anything extra, we'll profit off the idiots in Colorado who have followed a bad policy. But Jake, I'm going to ask you this. Are you still surprised? I mean, I guess I am a little bit. I'm still a little surprised that no one's really talking about the cost that came out of this Energy Office report. There still isn't a lot of conversation about it.
No, there really hasn't been. And I don't know if it's intentional or not, because you haven't really even seen the governor's office kind of tout this study. And I don't know what exactly to make of that. And your point is exactly correct. I haven't seen a single report. They reported on it a little bit while ago. They leaked an interim draft of this where the costs were a little bit lower, and a bunch of headlines ran then. But when the final report actually came out, it was eerily quiet, which is, I think, a little interesting.
Yeah, I'm waiting for the journalist who will ask Governor Polis why he's gone from his bold plan for 100% alternative energy, wind and solar, to now decarbonization, sort of the roadmap 2.0 or whatever it's called. But
Right.
We'll continue to follow this, even if nobody else does, because we've been doing it now for 14 years.
Absolutely, yeah. Like I said, I'm sure this report will keep coming up in future episodes and future reports that we do here, because there's a lot to unpack here. But as we're coming up on time on the episode here, Amy, what 3 takeaways would you like to leave the listeners about this report and what it suggests?
One is that Governor Polis has reneged on his campaign promise. Now, I don't think that's a bad thing, but it was a pledge that he ran on. He ran ads on it. It was huge. They even call it his bold plan, his bold idea. They're not going to make it. They finally acknowledged they're not going to make it. So, not going to make that plan. 1. 2 is that the Colorado Energy Report, we know it has confirmed what we've known, which is that this is really expensive, and wind and solar can't power a state. We've known it. I'm glad they've said it. But I think what it really does, more importantly, so second thing I want to leave everybody with is that Colorado is focused on climate, CO2, of which we're a minute, tiny little fraction of the atmosphere, while other states are prioritizing the people in their states. So that's the second thing. We have a different approach to energy policy, and it's bad news for Coloradans. And 3, and I'm going to tease everybody with this one because I've got a story about it, get a generator. Oh my gosh, I found out today why it's so important, but we'll save that for another time.
Yep, listeners will have to tune in. That's all we got for this week's episode. If you like what you saw here, you can head on over to PowerGab.org to see our entire catalog of episodes. We release new ones every single week. If you want to suggest show topics, or you want to comment or engage with us, send that over to info@powergab.org. We love to hear from our listeners. They're an informed bunch. And you can keep tabs on the show by following us on your favorite podcasting platforms, whether that's Spotify or iTunes or right there on YouTube. But until next time, we'll see you guys.